Hello, good evening, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are in the world, and welcome to Risking It All with me, your host, Jake Bernardez, again. Today's an interesting session. I started this podcast with no real intent or knowledge of what it was going to be, and kind of focused on this concept that I would just get people who I knew or respected and talk about how they became who they are and the things that interest them. But what I found over time is actually I'm going deeper into the topics that interest me and using this as an opportunity to explore some thought leadership and expert in places that I find interesting. And hopefully you will do too. I have the opportunity in my life to lead and be led, as many of us have. And I've always found this concept of leadership and what makes a good leader really interesting. So today's guest is called Randy Raw. He is somewhat of an expert in how to lead or how to be led or how to know how to lead those by knowing how to lead them, which we'll get into, which will be interesting and it'll be fantastic. And I've got lots of questions and I'm sure I'm going to catch him on the spot multiple times with things he doesn't want to answer. So let's get on with it. Without further ado, let's get Randy on the show. Hey, Randy, how's it going?
I'm great. How are you, Jake?
I'm all right, thank you. Thanks for joining me, and I'm looking forward to a lot of questions I have for you. So let's start with a quick introduction. Obviously, your name, your location, your job, and then the three questions I ask every guest are your hero, who it is, your hobby, and the biggest risk you ever took, since it is called Risking It All after all.
Sure. So I'm Randy Raw. I'm the CISO at Veterans United Home Loans. We are a VA loan origination company in Central Missouri, right in Columbia, where the University of Missouri is located. So we're right in the middle of the state. It's kind of cold today, but hopefully warming up, and we'll get rid of some of the snow that we have. Since we're talking about leadership from the standpoint of my hero, the greatest leader to ever walk the earth, from my perspective, is Jesus Christ. He started a movement that people still 2,000 years later are following and continuing on with. We can talk about that at a different aspect of it. Hobby, beekeeping.
I did not expect that.
Yeah, I am a beekeeper, and ironically enough, we used segments from the Beekeeper movie for a lot of our security awareness campaign in October. If you've not seen that movie, not a huge Jason Statham fan, but the plot worked for what we needed to do, especially since I do keep bees. And then the biggest risk. This may not seem like a big risk, but I spent the majority of the early part of my career in government and education and quote unquote safe jobs, where you really almost had to commit a felony to be fired. And so I got invited to join this company 14 years ago, and I made this the step, which at that time I thought I was a big risk, but turned out to be the best thing I've ever done. Love the company, love the culture, love the people that are here. And love what I get to do, lead some awesome people and have opportunities to talk to people like you.
I never thought anyone would incorporate Jason Statham movies into security awareness training, but now we've got Mad Dogs talking about beekeeper jokes, but I'm just out there thinking, how many Jason Statham movies could I fit into security awareness training? Could I just make it like a meme of Jason Statham the whole way? Because you start combining Meg and Transport, and there's a lot of stuff you could fit into there. I think it'd work. I think it'd be great.
Yeah, the beekeeper specifically was really on target because it was about phishing and falling victim, but also showing the underside of what it is that we do, of what we're trying to protect people from. It is a business. It's a business that many of us are not probably wanting to get into, but it's what makes it continue to churn.
And I've just learned from Simon the fascinating fact that Jason Statham was a gymnast, apparently at school, and went to school in the middle of nowhere, evidently, if he went to school near Simon. That is fascinating. Good. Leadership. This is our topic for today, so I want to dive straight into it. And I want to start somewhat controversially. I usually at this point start talking about local or recent cyber news. I'm going on recent leadership news, and you can't say no. Donald Trump, good leader or not? And let me preface the question. The reason is any man who successfully gets re-elected has to have something about him. People want to follow him. So what are his leadership qualities? Why is he currently president of the free world, so to speak?
Wow, that's an interesting question. We've had a number of conversations internally about whether elected officials are truly leaders or not, because the requirement, it feels like anymore, to be elected, at least in the United States, is to be so far on one side or the other that you kind of create a polarizing effect. And the truth is, it's in the messy middle where real work gets done. So I don't know. I mean, there are aspects about Trump that you can see both on either side. It's there are some pieces where I'm sure the devotion that I've heard from some people that follow him is very, very, very strong. I obviously don't have contact with him and don't know him, so that's about really all I can comment on.
Yeah, it's interesting. If you've got any questions at any point in this chat, please feel free to drop them in and we can go with them. But leadership's a fascinating one because it walks such a fine tightrope. If you look at, like, obviously, you've probably seen news in South Korea where the incumbent president is being incarcerated to be impeached for trying to impose martial law, which you go automatically and go, that's pretty terrible. But at the same time, he had a huge number of people who were devoutly willing to follow him and die for him. Like, at which point you have this point of what is a leader? Like, is a leader someone who gets people to follow them? Or is a leader more than that?
That is definitely one part of it. Great leaders do have people that want to follow them because they've appealed in some way to some piece about that individual they're leading. I have a comment I make oftentimes of people who are led by someone want to be known and cared for at a level that they're comfortable being known and cared for. And when you think about technology employees, particularly in cybersecurity, we have wide ranges of people from extroverts to introverts and extremes of those, as well as a lot of people that have pretty significant neurodivergent skill sets. And I look at those skill sets as positives. But when you begin going down that path and thinking about the individuals, some of them really want to be known and cared for deeply, others less deeply. And so it's really, as a leader, it's how can you meet both, and how can you meet the people where they are. That gets harder the larger your team that you lead and the more you scale. But kindness, empathy, all of the what we would call emotional intelligence skill sets that unfortunately people label as soft skills, and I really don't like that label because they are really, really hard. But if you think of hard skills as the technical skills, and in cybersecurity, it's how to read logs, what's an actual packet doing, what are other things that we do technically. I like the idea of it. They're essential skills, not soft skills, especially from a leadership standpoint.
It's interesting. I want to come back to the divergence, and I want to come back to this concept of feeling loved. But you started by giving your hero as Christ, as Jesus, right? And saying is one of the greatest leaders of all time. Again, a very divisive historical leader. You could look at him as a revolutionary, a rebel that led to huge amounts of war and death, or someone who led a purely pacifistic movement of love, which is still embraced across the globe, right? So what makes him a leader? Why pick Jesus of all the leaders in history?
Because of what he started that's continuing to go.
So his legacy.
It's legacy. Yes, that's a great one-word synopsis, legacy. And I think a lot of leaders think about that. Not to go back too far on the Trump idea, but I mean, presidents think about what their legacy is going to be often, and whether they're able to actually accomplish that or not is played out in their presidency. But even we just had Jimmy Carter pass away in the United States. His legacy was largely impacted by what he did post-presidential service rather than during the presidential service. And so it really does come down to how you impact people, how you make them feel, how they feel when they're around you. Do they feel known and cared for? Do they want to follow you? Do they believe you? and how can you continue to build those traits, or not those traits, build that relationship at that level.
Two more slightly controversial questions, then we'll go into a bit more of the meat of this, but I'm just curious to keep diving deeper. So you talked about Jimmy Carter being kind of thought of more about his post-presidential legacy, and your legacy being the kind of what people remember, what people do in response to you. It draws me to kind of like, do leaders therefore need to be personally infallible? Let me give you context. Like, globally, Clinton's remembered for an affair. Clinton's not remembered for a lot of great presidential work that he did both globally and nationally for the US. So that points to then a leader's also held accountable for what happens in their personal life in a way that other people aren't. Is that?
For sure. And again, with regards to Trump, there's a lot of conversation around personal life versus what he does, as a presidential directive. So I don't want to go down too far there, but yes, I do believe integrity of living and having a life that is transparent, where people can see you're the same person when you're leading at work, when you're at home, the way you treat your wife and children, the way you treat the janitor. I do think that that's really important. It's important to have a congruent and integrous life. That's not always the case. And you asked the question, is it requirement to be infallible? No, I make mistakes every day. None of us are perfect. And so that is the challenge that we have, is when we make a mistake, when we fail as a leader, how do you recover from that? Hopefully you don't have major failures, but every day there's going to be something that gives you an opportunity to say, I don't know, or I was wrong. Thank you for helping me understand that better. That in and of itself is a huge mark, in my opinion, of what great leaders are, of someone who is not the smartest person in the room. They recognize it. They rely on their employees, the people they lead, to be the smartest people, and they empower them when possible to do great work, and recognize I don't have to be the expert, and it's really not beneficial for me to be the expert oftentimes.
Let me ask one more question. I've got to tread very carefully. We talked about legacy, and I'm trying to think leader versus good human being. Like, we could go back. So let's go to Hitler, right? Legacy is tremendous,
Yep.
Impactful on generations of time, but atrocities that are attributed to that legacy.
Yes.
But with a willingness and a discipleship of people who are willing to follow him unreservedly.
Yes.
Does that mean that he is quantifiably a good leader, although his actual characteristics, opinions, and virtues are terrible?
Boy, you really like to just jump right deep down in there, don't you?
That's what I'm here for.
It's a great question. I think it's an example of when people understand certain aspects around leadership and around manipulatory sort of facets, and they use their influence in malicious or bad ways, people will still follow. And in his particular case, he also had the military, the positional spot where he could just order things to be done, and people would follow them. That doesn't necessarily mean they're a great leader, but there are factions of people who will follow. Even going back to the Beekeeper movie, the people that are employed in these phishing schemes and in the back rooms and that sort of thing, they know what they're doing. They are gainfully employed in a scam operation, and yet some people will still go there. Not everyone, and so there are people leading in those organizations as well. So that's one of the things I think we have to be aware of, is that leadership does have a dark side, a shadow of what we do, and we have to be aware of what that impact is, and always have people around us who are calling us to account for what our legacy is going to be.
It's an interesting thought. I kind of grew up in security and social engineering, and part of social engineering is understanding how people think and being able to manipulate that process of thought by knowing what's going to happen next, right? And we'll get into it in a second, but you obviously wrote a guide on learn how people want to be led, which effectively means if you have the understanding of how people want to be led and can lead them in that way, then you can lead them anywhere. And therefore, like, good leadership attributes almost become dangerous if in the wrong hands. I guess that's where I'm trying to go with that one. It's interesting. Tell us about your guide. So I've obviously looked at it. I'm actually using it with my team currently. This concept of a good leader knows how to lead because they know how their people want to be led.
Yeah. So I'll give you just a brief history of kind of where this came from. So I was working with a person in a coaching academy, and we were talking about when we both graduated from college, both of us were blessed to have a really great leader right out of college. And then we had a number of different leaders, and some were more effective than others. And then later on, we had another great one. And we were talking about, well, what was it that made those leaders great? And we started naming off attributes. And so we came up with that list of, there's 25 of them in the How I Want to Be Led survey that I have. And we talked about, we whittled it down. There were a lot more than that. We whittled it down. And I really always try to even perfect that a little bit more of kind of grouping them together. But, there are things like share the big picture with me. Let's see, I'm drawing a blank. I should have the document up in front of me, but there's other.
Is there a
traits
link to it we can share? Right, you sent me the document, obviously, as an Excel, but is there a link to it we can share with the group that are watching?
There is, and I'll see if I can find that while we're doing this. But yes, I do have a link for it, and it's on my blog site. So give me just a second.
No, you grab that. Well, what I think is interesting here is, like I said, for me, and there's some people on this, Chris Hodder and some others who I've managed in my time. And for me, it's creating a culture where it feels like a family. I think that's what good leaders do. They create a unity where it feels like you're almost one, right? It's more than a workplace. It's a friendship. Yeah. And I think that unintentionally stems from this concept of knowing how people want to be led, right? We know how our children want to feel love. That's what you do when you raise a child as a parent. And similarly, you can translate that into the workplace. So I think it's where your guide gets at, is understanding what matters to people versus what doesn't is not the same every time. And so applying that helps you to get the best out of people. But what I like is this concept, not just get the best out of people, but get the best for people. It's not just what can I achieve with the team, it's what can I help that individual achieve.
Right. Zig Ziglar used to talk about all the time, you're successful when you can help enough other people be successful. And I think it's that same way. You brought up children. If you have more than one child, you realize they have the same DNA, but they have very different personalities, very different desires, and how you interface and interact with that child is that the best parenting is individualistic for who that child is and what they want, what their desires are. And it's a reciprocal agreement of sorts. I want to get the best from them, but I also want the best for them. And if it's just a take relationship, that's not going to really result in a very good leadership relationship at all. If it's got to be give and take, and it's got to be, people have to understand that I'm for them and I want them to succeed, and I'm only successful if they're successful. Because especially as you move on into higher leadership levels, there's a lot of time where there is very little that you can look back on in a day and say, I did that, or I'm successful because of that. You can say, I'm successful because that team did that, because the individual was able to do what I asked them to do, and it has an output, it has an impact on what we're doing. But that was not me. That was me leveraging an idea that I had, a thought I had, and helping that person be the best person that they can be the best human that they can be as well, in whatever the role is.
Anyone's got any questions, please post in the chat. But that gives me kind of two thoughts. One is, I think that a real leader, when they succeed, it wasn't them. When they fail, it was them. I think that's number one, right? You own failure, but you never own success. And I think that then the next two things is when your team outgrows you, when they're ready to effectively take your job, but they need to go somewhere else to find it. I think that's success. I think the other is, and I had this when I left Wistic, I said openly, when I leave, you won't notice I'm gone, because the team can do everything. Right? I'm just literally, I built the team, and now I can leave and it'll be fine. Like, it doesn't matter. And I think
that's exactly it. Too many people.
No, you go.
Sorry, go ahead. Too many people don't take that approach. They feel like if I'm not the key individual and that I hold back some things, therefore I'm holding back power, then I'm not successful. And it's completely the opposite. The best leaders are the ones who do provide plenty of opportunities for other people and make sure that when they're not there, things continue to move and continue to operate as you would expect. Because if you don't do that, then you've really left a hole, because none of us know when we're going to drive out of our driveway and be hit by something, or maybe something good happens, and we're like, okay, I'm done. I'm going to go spend life on a beach somewhere. Well, you don't want to leave your company. You don't want to leave your team in a lurch. So you've really got to be focusing on how do you replace yourself and be prepared for that. And hopefully your team will outgrow you.
Interesting. I guess, well, I've got your knowledge. Let's take some concrete steps in both directions, since you have a lot of insights here. Let's say I'm a team member and I don't feel like my leader's listening to me or hearing me in the right way, or I don't feel like I'm being treated the way I want to be treated. I don't feel like they're getting the best out of me because I'm frustrated. So how do I, as a follower, quote unquote, a disciple, whatever you want to use as an analogy, someone being managed, how do I improve that situation? What do I do? What are my concrete steps?
Well, one of the things that I recommend with the How I Want to Be Led survey is take it and fill it out and say, these are rank the top 5 things that are important to you, and sit down with your leader and say, I just learned about this. Can we sit down and have a conversation around some things I learned, and how, if you're able to help me, if you're able to lead me in these ways, it would really help me be a much better employee. I would be shocked if a leader didn't recognize that and sit and listen. On the other hand, if they don't, that may also be a lesson to say there are just people in leadership roles that are not really very good leaders. That's one of the things. There's in often broad definitions. There are lots of people that were promoted. We use a phrase in the military. They're promoted to the highest level of incompetence. And that's what sometimes happens. The worst thing we can do is take our best individual contributor who is great at doing technical work, particularly in cyber, and promote them to a people leader, because they don't want to lead people. Oftentimes they don't really enjoy people. And then you put them in a leadership role where they have to interact with individuals and deal with all of the people aspect. They're not happy. The people they lead are not happy. And we just set them up for failure. And there are people in leadership roles like that. And sometimes if you find yourself in that spot, the only thing you can do is find another spot to go.
Well, I've got a bunch of thoughts over that. Simon's raised one. I've got a couple of other thoughts as well. So Simon mentioned a pod I did not long ago with Adam Arellano, who you might know, who's the CTO at Traceable. And he talked about having a user guide. He has what he describes as an interesting personality. And I've had previous CEOs who have written like user guides, based like, this is how I work. This is how you should work with me.
Yep.
You think that's a good thing? I've been considering writing one ever since I spoke to Adam. I've just not got around to it, but I think like I probably need one too.
Yes, and you could really geek out on this and spend a lot of time. There's a lot of personality assessments that you can do, lots of other things that you can do to assess and determine how I work best, where I work best, what are the sort of things. And yes, creating a user guide is a great opportunity to do that. It's a collection of things, though. There's probably not a singular piece. And you've also got to know yourself. If you're going to be able to put together a user guide, and then you're able to go to that your leader and say, here's kind of the manual on how to get the best out of me. If you can lead me in this way, I'll do great things. We're in the height of both the college football and the NFL playoffs right now. And we often will hear about the greatest coaches that their football players would run through a wall for them. I've seen that, where the coach has made a connection with that individual, and they know how to both encourage them, how to inspire them, and how to get the best out of them while rewarding them in the way that they want to be rewarded. Because that's another part that we have to be careful of. Not everybody wants the same reward or in the same way. I've got a couple of employees that they really do not like public recognition. Even when they've done an awesome thing, they just hate it. It causes them to shrivel, but they would kill for a handwritten note, of something that just comes in the mail. And so, that you just have to know what is it that really is inspiring for people, that is meaningful for them. It's kind of like there are the 5 languages of love. What is it that each individual, how do they prefer to feel loved? There's a parallel in work. Is it somebody that wants to know the big picture? Do they want to be challenged? Push them outside their comfort zone? Do they want me to be self-aware with them? Is it important for them to feel like they're treated fairly or equitably? Do they just want me to listen? There's a lot of conversation now around coaching and what coaching looks like. I have a coaching business, and I work with people on coaching is largely listening to someone else and drawing from within that person the answers to the questions that they're asking. But it's careful listening, careful and deep listening. And unfortunately, as leaders, we don't do that well.
I think it's a great point. I think it's an interesting thing, and I want to combine a couple of questions that are in the chat. So I think if someone says, look, this is how I want to feel loved. I want to be recognized in this way, or I want to be rewarded in this way. Whether for some people that's titles versus compensation, for some people that's notes versus public recognition, etc. Right? But I think in a practical scenario, how Prashant asked, how do you deal with the fact when the leader feels threatened effectively? And I think then Simon asked a question as well on, as a leader on day one, do you have a roadmap for success, right? So you come in as a new CISO, you got a roadmap for everything you think needs to be done in the business now. You go to your team and they want to tell you, I think your roadmap's wrong. I've been here longer than you. I think we should focus on these things. How, as the person being managed, do you engage in that conversation without the leader feeling threatened or without becoming confrontational to say, well, actually, like, I want to be heard. I think I've got ideas that are relevant here in a good way without being soft skill focused here.
Yeah, that's an interesting perspective. And I guess I would approach it maybe from a different way than you were thinking. If I'm a leader and I am unwilling to hear what my employees say, especially if I'm walking into a new realm, a new role, that may be a strike one for me, my perspective as a new leader. When I moved into new roles, that's the first thing I want to do. I want to hear from people. Also understanding you've got to hear from a multitude of people and realize you're hearing individual perspectives. There may be a lot of truth to what people are saying, or there may only be a small amount of truth that is a lot of opinion. And so you do have to be careful, and it's important to listen, though. You can't discount the person. You can't say you have no idea what you're talking about. I know all. You do have to listen, because what you may find is that the issue is not the first thing they bring up. And typically it's not the first thing. It's something secondary to that. But if you stop and take at face value the first, if you were to ask somebody what's on your mind and they tell you what's on their mind, that's probably the answer they think you want to hear. If you continue to dig, I did a one-on-one earlier this week with one of my employees, long-term employee I've known for a long time. Hey, how's it going? Well, it's going okay. Response, how you doing? I'm doing okay. And the employee said, why are we lying to each other? I'm like, man, this is awesome, because that employee knew me well enough and I knew that employee well enough. We knew we were not either one doing well. And so we took some time during that one-on-one to stop and talk about real issues in our lives outside of work, of what the real challenge was. And if you can develop that sort of human relationship with someone, that's really, really powerful.
Yeah, I think that comes back to my point of desire that, like, workplaces and teams, when they're smaller, should feel like families, in as much as you should know people's lives intricately, and your conversation should be driven by the emotional connection versus like the manager-employee relationship. I guess now flipping it, a lot of people, you say, and I agree, get into leadership roles by virtue of being there for longer, or being very good at their jobs, right? The most classic one I see is in sales. Fantastic salespeople become sales managers and CROs and are terrible at managing. And they don't actually want to be there. They're there because they were the highest performing salesperson like 5 years in a row. Where do they start? If you become a leader for the first time, you've never led people before, what are like 2 to 3 concrete steps to start on the right step?
So there is a great book that I recommend, and I actually give it to all of our technical leaders, especially if they were promoted to lead the team that they were part of. So they're now leading peers. It's called Herding Tigers. And it's a great book. The cover of the book has a tiger sitting in a chair, and it talks about leading creative people. And when I first read it, I'm like, oh, this must be. My preconceived notion was they were talking about leading like art, fine art creative people. But the more I read it, it's like, wow, this speaks directly to the technical leaders. So the first 99 pages of that are really awesome for a brand new leader in technology to read that book. Todd Henry does a great job of describing how some tangible steps of how to be different than you were and things you have to do now as a supervisor instead of a peer. But even if it's not in that peer relationship, even if you went outside your company or went to a completely different department, there's still a lot of great gold in that book. And in the last part of the book is really awesome information there. So that book, again, is called Herding Tigers. And I've probably recommended that some people before. I see Zach Lewis is here, and I think he's heard it before. A second one is also kind of related to it. Pat Lencioni wrote a book called The Motive, and he talks about leaders who are responsibility centered versus leaders that are reward centered. The reward centered leader is all about me, myself, I. How do I make myself look better? As opposed to the responsibility centered leader that is really focusing on the responsibility of leading these people, making sure they feel known and cared for, making sure that they are succeeding at whatever level they want to succeed. In our company, we have a number of loan officers, and they would rank from, we see rankings of the top one down to the bottom one. And there are people in the middle that their goals are not the same as the high performers. Their goals are, I want to make a living, I want to make an impact, but I also want to spend time with my family. And then there are people that are like, I want to blow it out of the water. I want to be the top performer all the time, every time. And they know what that's going to take. And so understanding and knowing what those individual people have as their goals and why it's their goal is really valuable as a leader to know, okay, the way that I'm going to interface with this person is different than the way I would in a different way.
It's interesting. I think one thing that's interesting being raised by Brian Meany in the chat, which I think is relevant here, is like in the UK and a lot of Europe, there's quite protected employment law, right? If you raised an issue and said, I'm suffering from anxiety, depression, I've got problems in my marriage, I've got problems with my kids, whatever, right? There is really strong protection that at that point you can't be terminated for whatever reason you've said. In the US, I think because of the Freedom of Employment Act, whatever it's called, the ability for people to leave or be fired almost immediately on the spot that day. How do you think that affects people's ability to engage properly, both up and down the chain, and how do we combat that?
So possibly, and this is ironic that you bring this up, because when I told you my biggest risk of moving from government and education, where you almost had to commit a felony to move into the big bad business world where you could be hired because you looked at somebody crossways, it's really not that way in most places. I'm not going to say unilaterally it's not that way, but majority of places that I've worked for and seen, there's a lot more going on behind the scenes than that. Yes, we are an at-will sort of organization, but for us, we have company values that are around how we treat people and how we treat our humans. And so again, if you find yourself in an organization that is not like that is very cutthroat, and it does feel like, I saw in the chat, somebody said you could be fired for not making eye contact with somebody. If that's really the case, wow, you probably ought to be finding another place.
You think that's part of the leadership conversation? Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but we talked about like if your leader isn't willing to not comply with, but kind of engage in the style you want to be led, should you adapt to that leader, or should you go and find someone who will adapt to your style? Like, what should you do if that happens?
Oh, that's a really interesting question, and some of that depends personally on your personal risk level and your willingness. Can you, quote unquote, lead up? Can you lead your leader and help them be better? Absolutely. Is it easy? No. Especially if that person is resistant. But is it possible? Yes. And so you've really got to ask yourself the question, if you find yourself in that role, do I have the desire to do that? Will I feel like, going back to legacy, is this a legacy I want to leave? Is this a thing that I want to put my heart and soul into? Or is this really kind of a lost cause and I need to find something different to do? in the job market that we're in today in cybersecurity, there are lots of jobs. At the same time, what we don't know is if they're the jobs that I qualify for or I'm interested in. And particularly when you lay beside that the hybrid versus remote versus fully premise sort of arrangement, that gets a really interesting matrix of, can I just go find another job? Because I've heard people threaten and they'll say that, well, I'll just go find another job. And they're still there working 3 years later. Well, what happened? Well, there's no other jobs that do what I want to do and the way I want to do it. Okay. Hopefully that's not the case if you're in a really caustic workplace. There are so many great companies to work for, so many places that people can go. I guess circling all the way back in answer to your question, I would encourage people, if they really find themselves in that caustic workplace, reach out to someone, talk to other people, build your network, find out, hey, is this like this everywhere? Or is this just me? And maybe even do some introspection. Is this maybe just me? Hopefully it's not, but there's a lot of opportunity for self-growth and for saying, am I showing up every day as the person that I want to show up to be? That's a lot of what my coaching focuses on, is asking that question. How are you showing up? And is that the person you want to be? Because if it's not, we can help you. We can help you be better. There are some things that we can do, some conversations we can have, some resources that are available to help people show up in the way they want to show up. But that's going to be some also hard personal work that they need to do individually.
Wow, Randy, this has been fascinating. I could talk to you for hours, but I'm going to run out of time. If people have questions for Randy, he's accessible via LinkedIn, email, and every other form of communication. Randy, any final thoughts to share before I share my final question with you?
I think as you think about leaders and we think about leadership, even some of the people you ask about being leaders, I think the more human, as we think about leading through the generations, the younger generations are demanding a more human-like experience with their leaders. And if you don't adapt as a leader to be more understanding and more human and more really understanding how I want to be led for those younger generations, you're going to find you maybe get pushed out and you may find yourself on the sidelines sooner.
I think that's a fascinating final thought. I think we are, as generations, adapting to technological and ideological changes in our workplaces very quickly, but we're not changing socially and emotionally quickly enough to the way that different people engage us in different generations. So I think that's a fascinating final thought. I have a tradition on this podcast that I stole from another podcast called Diary of a CEO, which many people have heard, and that is to close with a question that came from the last guest, not knowing at all who they're going to ask that question to, which is ironic in this sense. It came from an auditor back in December, and the question was, if you could be anybody else, who would you be and why?
Oh, wow. I should have thought about this.
I never get to time. Don't tell people in advance. I want on the spot thought.
Living
up to you.
Or not?
No, there's no strings.
Okay. I wouldn't want to be younger because the world ahead of us is a challenge. I guess it would be really interesting to go back and be the first CISO. Just to think about where we are. And I've grown up through some of that era of seeing the internet start and come along. But just to see if we could have influence in understanding what we know now, especially if I could take the knowledge that I have now of, wow, we can't just be open all the time. We've really got to build things with security in mind. If I could go back and start that conversation on a different note and help people understand there are better ways to do things.
Interesting. Randy, thank you, sir. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for taking the time. Your resources to your blog are available in the chat via the channels that you're consuming this podcast on. Also, I said reach out to Randy on LinkedIn, ask him questions. Anything for me, then please feel free to reach out. Otherwise, thank you for listening and spending half an hour of your morning, afternoon, evening, or whatever time of day it is for you. It's always our pleasure to talk to you, and I will catch you at all.
Thank you, Jake.